Welcome to another edition of the MDM podcast. I'm Mike Hockett, our executive editor. It would have been hard to miss seeing the news from March 28th that the Home Depot plans to acquire SRS Distribution for $18.25 billion in what might be the largest transaction involving a distributor in at least a decade. It was covered by B2B trade media everywhere, alongside all of the national news outlets. Besides MDM's news coverage recapping press release details, I provided a deep dive analysis piece of the deal in a premium article published April 1st. The deal is also the focus of this podcast episode, and I could think of no person better to discuss this blockbuster than Craig Webb. As the founder and president of Webb Analytics, Craig serves as a consultant to lumber and building material dealers and manufacturers. He's held editor roles at B2B publications Pro Sales and Remodeling from 2006 through 2018, at which point he launched Webb Analytics. Craig has also helped triangulate revenues for the building materials and construction supplies vertical on MDM's annual Top Distributors feature, and he has appeared on several MDM webcast events. So it was great to talk with a fellow editor and industry analyst to get his take on why Home Depot is buying SRS Distribution and how we see this deal impacting the building material supply market going forward. Enjoy. Craig, thanks for joining the MDM podcast.
Thank you very much.
You have collaborated with us here at MDM on the editorial side for a number of years, helping us with our top distributors lists and speaking on several webcasts and virtual events. So I'm sure that some of our audience is already familiar with you and where your expertise lies, but for those that aren't, can we start with having you introduce yourself and your career path, as well as what Webb Analytics is all about?
Well, Webb Analytics is a consultancy and a data firm that helps lumberyards and other construction supply companies spot the trends, the threats, and the opportunities that are about to rock their world and come up with ideas for how they can take care of those problems that they see coming down the line. It follows on 50 years of history as a journalist at places like the Wall Street Journal, United Press International, and for the past 18 years, the construction supply community. Some people may know me from the 12 years I spent as editor-in-chief of Pro Sales magazine, which was one of the biggest and certainly the most award-winning of the magazines covering the lumberyard community. And the last 6 now, I've been running Webb Analytics.
All right. Well, the focus of our conversation here today is on the Home Depot's pending acquisition of SRS Distribution, which was announced March 28th and sent a lot of shockwaves across this entire market. And just as a bit of a detailed recap, Home Depot is set to buy SRS Distribution, which is one of the biggest specialty building materials distributors in the U.S., for about $18.25 billion, which represents a 16 times EBITDA multiple for SRS. SRS ended 2023 with about 760 branches across 47 U.S. states and has almost 11,000 employees, which helped it drive $9.8 billion in 2023 revenues. So that, in a nutshell, is what Home Depot is getting here. And this is just a massive deal. So, Craig, I'm guessing this is about the biggest news that there can be for the markets that you cover. So what was your initial reaction to seeing that news that morning?
Well, I nearly choked on my Raisin Bran when I was seeing the news as soon as I woke up, and I realized, oh my God, we've got a story. It's the biggest deal in my world since Builders First Source and BMC came together. That sort of represented the culmination of all the roll-ups of the lumberyard world. This is certainly the biggest deal that I've seen involving what we call a specialty dealer, somebody that doesn't focus on lumber, but rather specializes on some other construction product.
And just as a bit of background, there's been a few other major acquisitions in the building materials and construction space over the past, let's say, 8 to 9 years. And that includes Clayton Dubilier and Rice buying HD Supply's Whitecap unit for $4 billion in 2020, ABC Supply acquiring L&W Supply for $670 million in 2016. As you mentioned, Builders First Source buying ProBuild for about $1.6 billion in 2015. But just based on this dollar amount, the Home Depot SRS deal is really in a world of its own. So for the other industrial and commercial supply verticals that MDM covers, just as a bit more context, the previously biggest deals that we saw were also both in 2020 with when the Home Depot reacquired HD Supply for $8 billion and Wesco International acquired fellow electrical distributor Annex International for $4.5 billion. But again, the SRS deal dwarfs those in terms of dollar amounts involved. So I know that tries to give some context there, but is there anything else that I'm really missing that might just help illustrate how big this acquisition is?
Well, I think one thing that makes this acquisition a little bit interesting for me is that it's not necessarily a marriage of equals or a synergy deal. This isn't one where you take two similar companies, bring them together, and then get rid of the legal and the HR department and other people and the logo issues.
Yeah.
This is what the M&A people love to say is an accretive deal in that it adds to what Home Depot does. And when they said that they talked about their total addressable market, they said our total addressable market used to be $950 billion. Now it's $1 trillion, excuse me. And so consequently, they're just basically adding on what SRS can do as opposed to trying to think about ways to strip it down and just take the parts they want.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting to see Home Depot CEO Ted Decker's commentary in the earnings call where, just as you said, it sounds like this, he kind of talked about this pro ecosystem that Home Depot has been building, for years. And Decker, I think, has been the CEO for, 2 years now, but he's been with the company for a while longer. And he really talked about how it kind of really got going in earnest when Home Depot added Interline Supply back in 2015. Then the reacquisition of HD Supply for the kind of the multifamily and residential maintenance market. And now with SRS, they're really targeting that specialty contractor that it just sounds like it's something that they've had offerings for in some capacity, but this just adds such a instant foothold and stronghold in that market. So, Home Depot has been voicing for several years now in press releases, earnings calls about this addressable underserved market that it, calls its pro customers. And I think it was in the middle of 2023 that they said that it estimates that there was a $475 billion addressable pro market, of which $375 billion of it was what they considered Home Depot's core professional customer. And then it added that Home Depot is it's targeting about $200 billion of the complex pro market. So that would be these pro contractors that are buying across these different channels of specialty trades, home and remodeling. And there's one I'm forgetting, but it's basically pros that are buying a little bit of everything across these different markets. So I know that's a lot of color there, but any thoughts on just any more that this does for Home Depot right away?
Well, I think it's important to sort of undress this phrase complex pro that they talk about. When I got involved in the lumberyard and construction supply business, one person told me years ago that a lumberyard really is three things. It sells things to you that it has, so it collects them and sells them. The second thing is that it's a delivery company. And the third thing is that it's a bank. In a bank, and that it gives you trade credit. So when the Home Depot talks about the complex pro, what they're talking about is not their typical customer. Their typical customer drives to the store, gives them money right away, and walks away with the product. So Home Depot, in a sense, has achieved 1/3 of what these other companies do. But the other 2/3 are the part that's been giving them trouble. One of the interesting things about the SRS acquisition that they brought up during the call with analysts is that SRS has a long history with credit risk management, selling things on credit. Home Depot is only, quote unquote, experimenting with it now. Another thing that SRS does well is that it's got a lot of delivery trucks. The Home Depot does not have delivery trucks per se. They've got flatbed distribution centers and the like, but this certainly raises the game. What I think this reminds us of is that the pro market is actually a huge number of varied markets. And so when the Home Depot says it wants to own the pro, I always tend to question that a little bit. Do they want the maintenance market? Maybe. Do they want the big builder? Do they want the custom builder? Do they want the high-end multi-million dollar mansion custom builder? Do they want the multifamily market? Do they want the replacement contracting market? They're all pro markets. So I think that sometimes these phrases that they're using tend to be a little sloppy when it comes to what they're really trying to do. With the acquisition of SRS, they are getting the third biggest of the three major roofing companies, which is to say that, and it gets them business that they did not have before, but it doesn't own the market for them.
Yeah. And further on that, I think I saw you cite some other stats in there or some research on that point of, this isn't like they get SRS and all of a sudden customers of Beacon and ABC Supply are all of a sudden going to start flocking to Home Depot. Any color on that, on what that means? Can we expect that these customers in, let's just say, the roofing market, since that's SRS's biggest product segment, do we expect that these customers are going to essentially stay where they're at, or might there be some shuffling, people, eyeing more out of SRS and Home Depot?
There might be some shuffling only in the sense that Big Daddy Home Depot can provide some funding or some technology to SRS to enable them to do things that they could not do before. But the truth is that SRS already has a very advanced app with a little truck that goes like an Uber driver telling you, when the delivery is going to be. They have very good technology. They know how to do their computer system right. So there is a general belief that no, unless the Home Depot walks in and says, hey, here's $50 billion for you to cut your prices on shingles, I'm not sure exactly what they're going to get. They're going to get the SRS customer. And SRS is going to continue to fight ABC Supply and Beacon for those customers. But by no means does the very fact that there's an orange label behind the SRS brand, is it going to make that huge of a difference?
Yeah, I think that's just a good point of clarification. Obviously, this is going to keep making waves for a while, and there's going to be a lot of hype around this deal. But yeah, I don't think we're necessarily expecting a seismic shift in terms of where customers are buying their roofing products from.
There's
but
even
yeah,
a thought that,
yeah.
I'm just sorry to interrupt. There's even a belief by one stock analyst I saw that Beacon actually is going to look better now. People are going to probably put more money in Beacon because, hey, if SRS is worth this much, what's Beacon going to be? That sort of thing.
That's very true. Yeah, Beacon and ABC and a couple other roofing distributors, they might just feel like their valuations just got a little bit of a bump here, just in terms of the hype surrounding this. And the timing of this deal is interesting because it came just about 2 weeks after Home Depot announced that it was planning to open 4 new distribution centers catering to pro customers in 4 major metro markets, with that being Detroit, Southern Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Toronto. So as far as the timing is concerned, this seemed to be kind of a double whammy of Home Depot saying, very clearly, we are all in on the pro market, one via, organic expansion of our logistics, and then this SRS deal being the biggest acquisition in Home Depot history. So just any thoughts on, the timing of these two, with them really kind of voicing that, we're all in on the pro.
Which pro are they all in on? I will bring that up again.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference between selling to D.R. Horton and selling to Clark Construction, which builds baseball stadiums, and consequently, when Home Depot says it's going to go after the pro, it might not be anything that you recognize as the pro. It might not have anything to do with the house. It might have something to do with commercial construction or the like. And so far, the videos that I've seen when the Home Depot shows off its flatbed distribution center in Dallas, none of the people they quoted as saying how great it was were actually home builders to
Hmm.
any great extent. So, but they're doing very well, Home Depot at it,
Yeah.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to change the face of home construction as we know it.
Yeah. So we've already kind of addressed this a little bit, but I was just going to ask, how much do we think SRS's roofing presence in particular played a factor into why Home Depot wanted it? Or was this more so just a purely market share grab for some pro customers? So yeah, just any thought behind that I know we've already kind of talked about this, but yeah, how much of a factor did just SRS having this known roofing customer share just play a part into why Home Depot went after it?
Well, it's also important to remember that the $9.8 billion that SRS got, only two-thirds of it came from roofing and exteriors,
Yeah.
siding, windows, doors, things like that. Um, of the other one-third, it's split pretty much half and half between their landscape supply group, which really is a great connection with the huge garden section that Home Depot has.
Yeah.
And the other half, or one-sixth of the total 9.8 billion, is in their relatively new pool supply group. And pools are not necessarily something that Home Depot is known for. So when people said this was an accretive addition to the company, in many ways, the landscaping and the others are a reason why.
I'd like to get into a bit of background on SRS and kind of how this plays context because SRS, it's always been privately owned since it formed 16 years ago. It's rapidly scaled since then by acquiring other private independent distributors. But it was a Berkshire affiliate, a private equity firm that Home Depot is buying SRS from for this 18 and a quarter billion dollars. But when I look at the branch counts, the location counts and the overall scaling of SRS, it really seemed like since Berkshire acquired it in 2018 fully, that's when this acceleration really kind of kicked into gear in terms of location counts and just overall footprint expansion. So I think you worded this in your coverage as it looked like SRS was a company that was almost priming itself for being acquired at some point down the road here. I was just curious if you can give a little more color on, why that's the case and why you saw it that way as SRS maybe was playing to be acquired all along.
Well, it there's a difference between companies that are in it to stay forever. There's a lumberyard in Maine that's been around 175 years.
Yeah.
Same family ownership. SRS was never meant to hang around for 175 years, at least not in its initial form. The people who created it had a lot of experience creating and buying and consolidating other roofing companies in the previous generation, and then selling them. The Ron Ross and Dan Tinker both were very, very involved in that in their previous life. So they've had experience in the consolidation industry, which is something that's been going on in lumber and building materials now, for the past 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
That said, they could have gone public, but I think the Home Depot was an attractive operation. In a sense, they have, in effect, gone public. The only company that probably was big enough to buy them at this point was a public company.
Yeah.
They could have done an IPO, but this makes just as much or more sense. They probably got a better deal out of it.
Yeah. One of the questions I have surrounding this deal is the branding aspect, just because this is, Home Depot's at least third major acquisition over the last decade. When it acquired Interline Brands in 2015, Interline eventually got rolled into Supply Works, which then became Home Depot Pro Institutional, which is now HD Supply since Home Depot reacquired HD Supply. And whereas HD Supply, HD is right there in the name, the brand, it was spun out of Home Depot originally, so that branding made sense to stick with it. SRS has been its own well marketable name for a while now. So I just wonder if SRS, the branding is going to be eventually rolled up into Home Depot, or if it's going to stay in, essentially an independent brand for those specialty contractors. Curious to get your thoughts on that, on, the branding aspect, because Home Depot in their analyst call really just said it's something we haven't really dug into yet. Maybe that comes later. So it seems like they're not voicing any branding aspects here, but any of your thoughts there on, what SRS, the name is going to be going forward?
Well, branding is an interesting issue for SRS as well internally, and not just in terms of their relationship to the Home Depot. Would adding the Home Depot name or changing the name to Home Depot Roofing do Home Depot any good? I don't think so.
Hmm.
SRS has got a better name, but frankly, SRS doesn't necessarily have a spectacular name of its own either, because for years it has been operating under dozens of different local brand names. And
Yeah.
it was a firm, they would tell you that it was a firm believer in having local brand names. Then they decided that they needed to get a little bit more national presence. And one of the things they did was they decided to sponsor a bowl game. And they realized that they didn't even have a commercial that talked about the whole company. And so then you started seeing some brands change to SRS Building Products, which did not exist before.
Mhm.
There also may be a color problem too. This is a strange little sidelight, but Dan Tinker is an enormous fan of Texas A&M. And if you start looking at some of the logos, by God, those colors look a lot like Texas A&M colors. So, whether, the orange of Home Depot would ever work or not is a different question. You're right. This is something to be dealt with in the future. I could see, for example, Heritage Landscape Supply getting its name, Heritage Pool Supply getting a different name. Maybe the roofing companies, they might or they might not change depending on how the times progress.
Yeah, the SRS Distribution Bowl has been, it was a sponsorship deal that they inked with, I think it was ESPN in 2021. And my Wisconsin Badgers were actually in that very first bowl game that they had. So yeah, it's been interesting as a,
And you probably said, who? What?
exactly. I think there's a lot of people,
That?
even today, that this most recent bowl game were probably like, what is SRS Distribution? So yeah, it seems like just as they were getting their branding under their feet, now all of a sudden they're going to be a part of a much larger corporation here.
Yeah, but I think that once again, they are going to be a separate part of a much larger corporation. They're not
Yeah,
incorporating their name like you said with the others.
yeah. Well, besides the other distributors that we mentioned, there are a couple of other major companies that this SRS deal figures to directly impact that I want to get your thoughts on. And the first is Lowe's, which is Home Depot's most direct competitor. But unlike Home Depot, or at least like Home Depot, Lowe's operates primarily as a DIY home improvement retailer. That's what most of the common folk know them as. But they do have a significant industrial and contractor supply operation. Whereas, unlike Home Depot, we haven't seen Lowe's make any splash acquisitions over the past decade. So, do you think that this latest deal puts more pressure on Lowe's to make a move of its own to avoid letting Home Depot or some of these other fast-growing distributors take too much of that pro market share?
Well, I would come back to you in two ways. One is, how much market share do you need to be big?
Right.
There is this notion that, once you get to a certain size, you can get better pricing or whatever. Lord, when you're as big as Lowe's or you're as big as the number three company Menards, do you think people are really ignoring you at Weyerhaeuser and other places when they're not going to put you on allocation?
Yeah.
So I don't think necessarily that's going to be that much of a factor. Lowe's is about 40% pro, but just like the Home Depot, that pro description is a bit of a challenge because it also includes painting companies, maintenance and repair operations, people who I don't always think of as the pro because they're not building things.
Yeah.
The other issue is, does Lowe's feel pressure? Maybe, but it's a big country and there's lots of money sloshing around and there's lots of pro dealers that you can compete with.
Yeah.
And Home Depot isn't everywhere. My wife's hometown in Eastern North Carolina, you go to the Lowe's because the Home Depot is 30 miles away.
Mhm.
You're going to find a lot of that.
It's a good point. The other company that I'm sure is watching this development with a lot of interest is QXO, which might not have a lot of name recognition yet in this market, but it is the building products distribution venture out of billionaire Brad Jacobs, who has built five multi-billion-dollar revenue companies, primarily in the trucking sector. And QXO launched or announced its launch this past December, during which it said it's looking to become a major force in building products distribution in North America and Europe, seeking a revenue run rate of at least $1 billion by the end of year one, $5 billion within 3 years, and tens of billions over the next decade. And I've seen speculation that QXO wants to compete with distributors like Builders First Source and Ferguson. So this deal makes me wonder if how it influences QXO's acquisition strategy, as I'm sure that it's currently building an acquisition pipeline to achieve those aforementioned revenue goals. Just any thoughts on how QXO views this deal?
Well, QXO is a giant question mark for everybody in our industry right now because, once again, the terms are so vague. What does
Yeah,
building distribution mean, for God's sakes, when you've got everything from people putting concrete down for highways and other people building mansions for, Mookie Betts, in
yeah,
Tennessee or whatever. And so that can be a challenge. The one thing that I tend to think more than anything else with Brad Jacobs is that he thinks that technology is going to make a difference.
hmm,
Technology makes a difference if you can have standardization and if you can have consistency. Much of the home building industry in America is incredibly inconsistent. You're building on different land with different models, with wood, for God's sakes, a non-consistent product all by itself. And with inconsistent small customers who don't have the size to really do anything. Even when you get to the biggest builders in the country, it's a complicated business. I have tended to think that Brad Jacobs' goal is probably going to center more on the commercial world, perhaps the multifamily world, um, or something like, let's say, student housing, something where you've got a little bit more consistency going on, or even just all those hotels by the side of the road that get built. Consequently, I don't think that this deal is necessarily in his ballpark.
hmm,
I think he's going to go for something that's probably a little closer to the rest of MDM's world.
yeah.
If you can, I'd go back to you and say, can you name a business sector which has relatively bad computer systems?
Hmm.
And if you could name one, then I think that might be someplace you might go.
Yeah, that's good color there. Well, this SRS blockbuster deal comes amid what has been a very tough market for building materials and construction distributors amid the current housing market. And the latest Census Bureau data showed that February U.S. housing starts were up 1.9% from January and up 2.4% year over year. So there might be a little bit of momentum there right now, but overall, the sector is coming off a tough 2023 in which MDM's forecasting shows that revenues were down 12.3% versus 2022, and we are projecting a 4.0% annual decline in 2024, before things pick up in 2025 with about a 4% increase. I know there's different estimates all over the place, but can you can you share about what you're hearing or seeing in terms of what it's like out there for current business conditions and what kind of optimism is out there?
Well, I'll come at this two different ways. The first has to do with the data that I tend to collect on the revenues of some of the biggest building material dealers. I've been doing this for 18 years now, and I have never seen as many people report to me negative, a slide backwards
Yeah.
in terms of revenue from one year to the other than they are for 23 versus 22. And the reason, though, I think that they are willing to give me those numbers is because everybody knows it's not their fault. It's what happened to lumber. And I don't think people, and this is part number two, that people realize just what a profound impact the drop from extremely skyrocketing high lumber prices to more normal prices had. As an example, the Home Depot, their lumber alone went down by about $1.6 billion, just their lumber sales. And overall, it went down 13% in terms of lumber. If you look at their overall revenues, it probably took up half of their drop in revenue. Lowe's is the same way. Builders First Source went from $8.1 billion worth of lumber sales to $4.1 billion worth of lumber sales. They were a $21 billion company. Now they're a $17 billion company overall. Lumber did it. So in terms of the way the numbers look, the numbers are going to look absolutely horrific when I report my construction supply 150 in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
In terms of unit sales, they probably weren't much different.
Yeah.
The difference that has to figure in is whether when lumber prices were going crazy, these dealers were also giving pay raises to their sales reps, pay raises to their staff in order to keep them. And now that lumber is going to go back down, it's not like the employees are going to give back their money. So you're operating from a more expensive operational base. In general, though, dealers are feeling good. Third thing I would bring up has to do with when you're looking at housing starts. I think that there's a limit as to how high we can go just because we don't have the labor. I'm sure that you've got a million other people in other fields who said, oh, my, distribution business could be 50% bigger if only I could find the people to drive the trucks.
Indeed. Yeah.
Same thing here.
And yeah, those revenue numbers, it's very important to keep that context in mind because when you look at 2023's revenues compared to 21, 22, it almost looks like the sky is falling out there, but you have to keep in consideration just how high that was coming off of, inflated by just inflation out there. So of course there was going to be a huge downtrend when everything started normalizing. So yeah, there's volume wise is kind of, I think the key number to keep in mind here is, how many unit sales happen. And like you said, overall pretty steady out there. It's just the raw revenue numbers that look like they were devastatingly bad.
And those are lumber yards that I remember that I'm talking about. Beacon and the others, SRS, both went up. Yeah. That's because lumber is not a huge part of their sales mix.
Yeah. And you mentioned the construction supply 150 out there. And then I know that this Home Depot SRS bombshell deal came out right as you're trying to market a different new report out of Web Analytics, which is your 2023 LBM deals report. And as that title suggests, it is a comprehensive report detailing essentially everything that happened last year on the M&A side in lumber and building materials. And it is free to download.
Right. All you have to do is go to web-analytics.com and you'll be able to just fill out some forms. And I've got right now something on the order of 4,300 different deals that I talk about in one way or the other. We're up to 5277 now that now that the SRS deal has taken place. So between that one and also the construction supply 150, that'll be available on May 1st.
Yeah, and much like MDM's top distributors feature, I can only imagine the amount of research and legwork that must go into these reports. Can you walk me through a little bit of, either the methodology or just the research process that goes into either the LBM deals report or the construction supply 150, just kind of what goes into creating those two reports?
Well, the vast majority of the construction supply 150 comes from the participants themselves. They fill out a survey talking about their size, their style, their growth plans, how hard it is to find workers. I've asked questions about their male-female composition, minority composition, what their turnover rates are, things like that. Also, what they sell. The places that don't provide it I tend to be able to get it from public resources like, the annual reports of companies.
Yeah.
And I start with the Home Depot and I work my way down. So, there's a decent number of those companies. Then the third source is press reports and announcements by the companies themselves. That tends to be much more the source of the deals and the acquisitions report. Although sometimes there's a lot of digging there too. Somebody will come up to me and say, "Oh, that store closed 3 years ago,"
Mhm.
and it goes into the backwards database. So
Yeah.
in some ways, it's I've even got stuff from 2019 I'm putting in now.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a continuing database of information. And like you, yeah, you don't sleep very much right about now.
Mhm.
And there's, you have a million numbers in your report, and that means that you have a million ways you can make a mistake.
Yep. Yeah. Just so much cross-referencing and just double checking on facts and figures. And yeah, it is a lot of sifting through just company reports, press releases, especially on the quarterly financial side, really getting into some of these annual reports to find that one particular piece of information that you're looking for. So yeah, a lot of due diligence involved. And yeah, I know it's the same for you. Well, on that note, I would like to touch on the overall state of M&A in the lumber and building materials markets, which tend to be, at least from my perspective, a lot more top-heavy than some of the other industrial and commercial supply verticals that MDM typically covers. And we've seen a group of a dozen or so construction building materials supply distributors be very active over the past 5 years or so. And we've kind of mentioned these: Builders First Source, ABC Supply, Beacon, and SRS have all grown significantly via acquisition recently. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the overall state of M&A in these markets and if it figures to remain dominated by these major players.
Yes, the domination will continue and the acquisitions will go on. Now, they have been going on for decades, probably since the 1960s. And the reason why is that it's just more efficient to run a lot of stores than it is to run one. And this is happening in a whole variety of different places. I'm seeing certainly in the hardware store business, you're seeing consolidation take place
Yeah.
all the time. I'm seeing roll-ups or consolidations going on with garage door installers, um, carpet layers, just, everybody. Will we ever get to the point where there's going to be one or two companies doing this? No. I remember a group of Japanese came over one day, and I was giving a speech to them, and they said, "What's the biggest remodeling company in the United States?" And I said, "Well, there's this company or that company are pretty big." And they said, "Oh, well, they're from coast to coast, right? They're in every state." And I said,
Mm.
"No, there is no such thing as a dominant 100%
Yeah.
controlling remodeling company. Whereas in Japan, yeah, they'll have three
Mm.
companies and that's it from one end of the island to the other, and we just don't have that. And it's so there's thousands more companies to be acquired or to stay independent, depending on what they want to do. A
Yeah.
lot of people tend to forget that it's relatively easy to get into this business. And I have new people showing up on my lists all the time.
Yeah.
So while we're having consolidation, we're also having startups, fresh shoots.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems to be the same group of dozen or so distributors making all the headlines in building materials and construction supply. But like you said, there is still considerable fragmentation underneath that
Yeah,
should
and
be
and and
ignored out there.
frankly, the vast majority of purchases are actually made by somebody who's buying a store the next county over.
Hmm.
There's a lot of that, and the average number of locations per deal last year was 3.4 locations.
Hmm.
In 2022, it was 2.7. In 2021, it was 4.4. Those are not mega deals.
Yeah. That is remarkable when you see, like, I mean, this SRS Home Depot deal is definitely an outlier, but yeah, that's those averages you mentioned are even factoring in some of these, you know, fairly big deals where it might involve, 50 locations or 30 locations,
Correct.
something like that. So it just does show that there is still remarkable fragmentation out there, even amid all this consolidation happening.
Right. I think that if you really want to be in the business, you've got a chance to be in it. And there's private equity money that'll back you up.
Yeah. Well, that is all the questions, the planned questions I had for you, Craig. But before we sign off here, is there any other final thoughts or, last minute nuggets that we haven't already touched on?
I would just say, Mike, that both you and I are lucky guys because we get to cover an industry and a set of people who um, get up earlier than I possibly get up and work later than I possibly can work, and they make things possible. And they deserve more respect than they get, the people who make the distribution possible in this country. And so it's fun to deal with them. I wish there were more reporters out there covering
Yeah.
them, but I'm at least happy that you and I have that opportunity to do that.
Yeah, when you just consider the market value or the size of the markets that we are covering out here, it is kind of remarkable just how few media there is covering these companies that are doing a lot of exciting things. So, yeah, we're definitely wearing a lot of hats here. Craig, thanks once again for stopping by the MDM podcast.
Yeah, I look forward to reading your reports coming out and talking with you in the near future because the news keeps coming out, doesn't it?
Definitely. Thanks again, Craig.
All right, bye-bye.